Hey, it's Mosquito, also known as Chris. Welcome to the shop. Today we're going to take a look at a Veritas Boxmaker's plow plane, and this is a pretty cool little plane. Let's dive right into this. We'll get an overview, we'll get sort of a review, and then a comparison with the 043, but more importantly, I'll give you my opinion, which is probably not all that important, but I appreciate you being here anyway. So, in full disclosure, I did buy the Veritas Boxmaker's plow plane at retail price pretty much as soon as it came out. But I did not get paid to make this video. I did not get paid to have the plane. They did not give me the plane. I bought the plane. I bought the irons because, I don't know, I have a problem. So anyway, I was actually in contact with an engineer that worked on designing the Boxmaker's plow plane, and I'll be including some of those questions that I was asking them along with their responses in this video, just because I thought, hey, if I was curious, maybe, no, sorry, not you, over there, you, yeah, you're probably curious too, so anyway. All right, so what is this? This is the Veritas Boxmaker's plow plane. This is the record 043. I did ask the question, and yes, they did use the 043 as kind of a design reference for the Boxmaker's plow plane. And this is a miniature plow plane, much like the 043. It does a very good job at making little grooves for things like drawer bottoms and box bottoms, box lids, that kind of thing. But this one also has the ability to use beating irons, which is pretty sweet, and they actually think that's one of the big things that this plane will get used for, and I would say that I would probably agree because it's pretty nice for that. This is $159.99, so $160 US, and that includes the 1/4 inch iron, which is not this one, but you can buy additional irons from Lee Valley / Veritas, and that is using the small plow plane irons. So even though this doesn't have a depth adjustment, which we'll get into later, it does use the small plow plane irons, which have that little notch, because those do. And the question is, at $160, is it worth it? Yes, but also no. So maybe?
So the way that a plane like this comes about is, well, for planes in general, the impetus to develop a new product can be any sort of reason, whether it's a blank slate, wanting something that's a different variation on something that we already have released, or if it's just somebody comes to us and says, hey, I think that we should consider something like this, maybe, make an XYZ tool. It could be any of those reasons. And in the case of the Boxmaker's plow plane, we saw a need for a smaller, simpler, lower cost plow plane. And our existing small plane is a very capable tool. However, some woodworkers just didn't need all of its capabilities. So a search of the woodworking record and our tool collection supplied the record 043 and various other clones of it, which we used as a guide regarding feature set, size, general configuration. We modified the ergonomics somewhat. Our handle is substantially larger than an 043 and adapted the design to fit some of our existing design features, such as the blade clamping screw, the fixed lever cap, the blade sizes, and then applied more contemporary form giving. For something like this, development would generally be about 6 months for creating a definitive design, with a further 12 months or so to get from there to production on the shelf. In this particular case, it was much longer, largely due to the supply chain issues from the pandemic, but Veritas is also undergoing significant manufacturing transformation in order to keep up with the demand of our existing products, which took priority over new product development.
All right, on the subject of plane irons, the ones that Veritas sells with the plane, well, it comes with one 1/4 inch iron, which is actually this one, and the other ones are optional. You can buy them as you need them or as you want them. Now, these are the ones that are intended for their small plow plane, so there's actually notches in all of these here, so there's a little bit of a depth adjustment notch there at the top. And for the Boxmaker's plow plane, that depth adjustment does not matter because there isn't one. As far as these go, they do sell left-handed and right-handed versions. The only thing that really changes is which side of the iron that notch is on, except for the two narrow irons, so the 1/8 inch and the 3/16 inch iron. Because this plane iron is actually stepped, it does actually matter if it's left hand or right hand, because that step will be opposite for the other one. So that's just something to keep in mind, is for the smallest two irons, it does actually matter. You do have to pick the right one for your plane. Otherwise, well, this will be hanging out in space, not against a plane, and that's not what you want. What sizes? So the small plow plane irons, well, obviously you can get a 1/4 inch, but the plane already comes with that. But there is another 4 that you can get in the imperial sizes. So there's 1/8 inch, which I actually have in the plane, and then there's 3/16 inch, and then there's 5/16 and 3/8. And those are all roughly $19, $18.90 US for those individually, or you can get the set, which again, this is the 1/4 inch, so that comes with the plane. So you can get the set of those 4 for $68 currently. And then there's also 6 metric if that's your preference. And you can get those, they're the same price, otherwise they're $99.50 for all 6 of them, but there's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 10 millimeters available for that. And then they also have these beating irons, which again, same as for the small plow plane, and they are 1/8 inch, 3/16 inch, and 1/4 inch, and those are $23 a piece, or $67 for the set of 3. So that covers the irons. But the next question is, do you need all of them? No. You don't need any that you don't want. So you get the 1/4 inch iron. I would say between the 1/4 inch, which is this one, between the 1/4 inch and the 1/8 inch, that's probably going to cover most of what you're going to do with the Boxmaker's plow plane, because I'm guessing that's either going to be a 1/4 inch for drawer bottoms, box bottoms if you're using 1/4 inch material, or 1/8 inch. So those are probably the two that I would probably end up wanting the most. So the one that comes with the plane, and then the 1/8 inch I would probably add on. But unless you typically do end up using something that's in those 16ths or 3/8 size, might not really be worth it. But where the 3/8 iron might be nice is for rabbets. If you're going to do rabbets for box bottoms or drawer bottoms instead of a groove, that might be a scenario where you would want that instead. But the beating irons, that is pretty nice. Completely unnecessary if you don't think you're going to use beads. So I happen to like doing little decorative beads on stuff, and the fact that this can do that is pretty sweet. So do you need them? No, not really. Only get what you want. So now the question is, if you are coming from the vintage tool realm like I am, I've got a couple of Stanley 45s, that might be an understatement, and with those I have various irons from those planes. So I guess the question is, do these work in the Boxmaker's plow plane? And the answer is, well, it depends. The 1/4 inch is fine, but 1/8 inch and 3/16 inch don't actually work. So they fit. Well, here, let me show you the problem. So because the Veritas have the step and the Stanley do not, there's just not enough width in the plane irons to actually register against the body of the plane and that thumb screw. Not a huge deal, you might be saying, because you can just, push it there with your hands, tighten it down, and call it good, just like most other planes. However, because they made the plane with these plane irons in mind, this thumb screw in the lever cap does not actually sit far enough over to engage on these well. So I'm just going to put the 1/8 inch iron in there for demonstration to show you what I was talking about. Does not fit on that plane iron very well. So definitely not something that I would recommend, because you start trying to put force, basically it's just on there with the thread. So you're going to destroy that thumb screw in no time if you try to use this with that 1/8 inch iron from Stanley. So unfortunately, the narrow irons, you're going to have to go with the Veritas, or make your own, or find some that have that similar step in them. You're better off just to buy the Veritas ones. But that is what it is. All right, so the plane is obviously kind of divided up into two different things, the main body casting and the fence casting. And since there's fewer parts to go through, I'm going to talk about the fence casting first. First things first, the fence is fixed to the rods. So obviously it has the two rods, and then there's the two screws in the end of it that go into those rods through the body of the fence. So these are slightly annoying, and I have had these off, so it's not as bad on mine. But they are actually Loctited in place, or some sort of thread locker at least, because boy, were these obnoxious to get off the first time. And once you do get them out of there, so see, these are just two regular screws. So there's the fence rods. Ugh. And as you can see, not only are they fixed to the fence, they're stepped. So there's this little step here right at the end that fits into the casting of the fence, which is unfortunate because this end needs to be this diameter in order to work with the main casting, but then this end needs to be that diameter in order to work with the fence casting. So, if you wanted to make shorter rods, that kind of screws you over. So, yeah. You can't actually buy any rods for this that I'm aware of, so you would have to be either able to make them yourself or know somebody that could, which, to be fair, it's not that hard. Like, if you have the capabilities to make something like that on a metal lathe, it's not that hard. You know, it's just a step, and then it's threaded in the middle on the end, and that's it. I don't have that capability, and I would like to have shorter fence rods. Kind of annoying. Moving on.
When it comes to the design reasons for going with the fence rods fixed to the fence casting, we did test with the rods fixed to the body of the fence sliding on them. The plane was impossible to hold comfortably, particularly with the small fence offsets we anticipate the plane will typically be used with. Getting a secure and comfortable grip on the fence is kind of critical to ensuring it is in contact with the workpiece, so that's kind of why we decided to go with sliding rods stuck to the fence rather than the other way around. And currently there are no plans to offer short rods, but that is an option if we find that there's a significant demand for them.
They do include a sub-fence here. They're saying it's torrefied or roasted maple, so it's basically just been essentially baked. And it is pre-attached, and it's there, and it has this nice recess for if you wanted to use this for rabbets, so that you can move the blade into this little recess, and it's that full length because then they can use this same part for both the left and the right-handed planes, because the iron ends up about here on the right hand and about there on the left hand. So that works out pretty nicely. Now the way that they're holding this fence onto the casting is also a little bit annoying. I understand why, and after, well, here, just take a listen to the answer quick.
On the subject of the fence casting being threaded to receive the machine screws for the wooden fence rather than the other way around where it's just a recess like the 043, the threading into the cast fence gives a much more secure fitting, and we were concerned that the wood sub-fence would end up needing to be much thicker in order to get solid thread engagement with wood screws. So that's why we ended up going with the threads on the fence casting itself rather than threading into the sub-fence.
So after that explanation, I do kind of agree. It does make sense that it probably is the better, quote-unquote, better design from the aspect of then this isn't quite so limited on having to be thick enough to have enough threads. But at the same time, if you want to make your own, you got to get those pretty much right. I mean, if you don't get those accurate, then the problem you're going to run into is they won't fit. And then you might have to redo it, and then that'll be really obnoxious. So the way that the 043 has it set up is these fence castings just have two holes in them for those two screws, and then they just go into the fence wood itself. And this one actually is pretty close to the same thickness. It's maybe a 1/16 of an inch thicker. And so I didn't have any issues with this. It's not like you're putting a ton of force on this all the time, so you don't really need to have it be super, super thick so that you can have like, you know, 3/4 of an inch of screw in this thing. But it would have been kind of nice, I think, if you'd be able to do that. Again, I guess there's nothing stopping you from just using a smaller screw and going through those holes anyway. That might be what I do, because certain things like having an angled fence, if you wanted to do something that wasn't necessarily at 90 degrees, that would give you that option. But not the worst, not the best. Take it or leave it, doesn't matter a whole lot, I guess, depending on your use case. Now, the way that this fence works with the main casting is obviously it goes through the 2 holes in the main casting, and then there's just these 2 button head screws that you tighten down with an Allen wrench, which is included, so it does come with the Allen wrench, which I guess is at least pretty nice, even though it's just an Allen wrench. But those you tighten down, and that's what holds your fence in place, and depending on where you have it set, that kind of determines how much of the rods stick out the other side. So obviously if you're going to be working closer to the edge of the board like this, you're going to end up with an awful lot of those rods sticking out the back. Not a huge deal if you have some form of work holding that isn't taller than your workpiece, but if you are using holdfasts, which I typically use holdfasts, they can and will at some point probably get in the way. So, yeah, I don't know. Again, dead horse, probably beat it enough. But one thing that I do kind of wish is that it did have the same approach as the 043, where the fence rods were fixed to the plane and then the actual fence moved, not the rods. And I do highly prefer that. So I think that is honestly a step, in my opinion, backwards. For example, you know, you've got these Allen screws, Allen head screws that are fine. I mean, I get it. And, well, actually here, I did ask that question. And so here's the explanation for why they decided to use these button head screws with the Allen wrench as far as tightening that fence down.
Now, the button head screws for tightening the fence rods, they were something that we did look at. So we did originally look at brass knobs for those screws, but found that the back one especially, it was pretty tight to get a good grip on them. It was felt that many users would want to use a tool to tighten it anyway. So the original 043 also uses screws, but they were flathead. Button heads were pretty much an aesthetic choice at that point. The rounded tops fit integrated with the rest of the form giving. So when it comes to the fence rods and possibly making them flat topped, the original plane design actually did adopt a single fence rod that did have a flat top, but in practice it was impossible to lock the fence such that it wouldn't loosen in use, and we never were able to figure out exactly how it was loosening up. A 2-rod design solved that problem, and flats in this case just wouldn't avoid the screws marking the rod in the end, and again, would add to cost, so that's why those are completely round rather than being flat-topped.
So that's the argument for why they would have it, but at the same time, I bought these Thumbscrews from McMaster Carr, so some of them were brass, and then the other ones were stainless steel with what actually had a slot in them for a flathead screwdriver. And they were long. I couldn't find the right length to fit for this. I mean, I guess technically it would have been fine. They'd just be sticking way up, which would have been kind of hilarious, like a little mini knob. But they do fit, so I'll leave a link in the description for what I bought specifically. But they do work, and it is, to their credit, a little bit obnoxious. Like, that is a little bit tight in there as far as space to be able to crank that down, but truthfully, I think I much prefer this. And if you don't have the finger strength or dexterity to use these little tiny thumb screws, you could always just get a flathead as well, because if you are coming from, say, the vintage hand plane realm, there's a decent chance that you'll have a flathead screwdriver around, more so than I'd rather keep an Allen wrench around, because I'd rather have a flathead screwdriver than an Allen wrench. All I did was, I actually bought one of these sort of like rounded head nuts, and then I filed it down until it was the length that I wanted it to be. And then I put the screw all the way up in there, and then I just filed this off until it was down to the top of that nut. Then I just kind of cleaned them up and rounded them over a little bit. But I do understand the point that having a mechanical device such as an Allen wrench or a screwdriver might be preferred by many, but my personal taste, I would rather have something that I can just do without tools. So there you have it. That is the fence portion. One of the big improvements of this over the 043, this skate here is actually beveled at the very edge. And what that allows is for the beating irons to actually be used, because if we were to grab one of those, so with this beating iron, the problem is those facets right there are a lot narrower than the skate was otherwise. Usually that would be about 1/8 of an inch width on that skate. That's what the record 043 is. But the thing is, with the Boxmaker's plow plane, it has that bevel, so that allows these to actually be useful, which is really, really nice. That's probably the second most important thing to me about this plane, is the fact that you can use it for beating. So that's pretty nice, and that is a huge improvement over the 043. Now, as far as the ergonomics go, this is a little bit wider and a little bit different shape than the record 043. Both of those kind of in a side-by-side profile comparison, you can see that this is similar but slightly different. So the Veritas plane is much more rounded on the back, whereas the record is a lot straighter and flatter. But as far as the width goes, this one looks quite a bit wider. But I do find the ergonomics of the right hand of the Boxmaker's plow plane to be, in my opinion, a little bit better than the 043. And one of the cool things that I noticed here was this ledge at the bottom is, well, at the bottom. On the 043 plane, it is much higher. And obviously that's for reinforcement of the plane itself. But what I like about that on the Veritas is that is a really convenient place for me to tuck my fingers. So occasionally I'll forget, and what I end up doing is I get my fingers down below that bottom ridge, and then I'm planing, and all of a sudden you just ram this into the beginning of the board, and ooh boy, is that a fun, great time. Whereas this ridge is actually pretty wide, and it's a pretty nice place to tuck your fingers. Now, you do have the fence rods kind of sticking through that area, so that is something that will get in the way of your fingers if you try and stick them there, but for my particular grip, it's actually pretty easy. I just kind of tuck my pinky in behind it, and then my ring finger in front of it, and then middle finger is there, and then I typically end up with my pointer finger somewhere up here. So I find that pretty comfortable.
So on the right side of the casting, there's sort of a reinforcing ridge, and it kind of runs along the whole right side or left side, depending on which plane you have. But the major technical reason for the depth of that rib, it's a little bit lower than on the record 043, and this is to give stiffness across the mouth opening. So where the iron is, it's asymmetrical castings like this are one of the difficult things to keep straight. So especially when the mouth is opened up during machining. And so visually, the rib completes a frame, so to speak, around the more mechanical features of that side of the plane.
I like the depth stop. It's got a bevel front and back. So the nice thing about this is that it kind of ramps into your workpiece, so that way you don't have just the hard edge of your depth stop there, which is pretty nice. And it is a little bit smaller than on the 043, which obviously, I mean, this gets reused by a bunch of things. But one of the things that I think is really nice is that recess right there. So the depth stop actually goes up into the body of the plane. So there's this nice little recess here in this bottom ridge, and that just allows the plane to be completely assembled, but also be all the way down to its full roughly 3/8 inch depth. So that's pretty nice. And when I was looking at it, I did notice that there was this little weird hole in the end of it. And then I was kind of looking again, and it's like, oh, wait a minute, that thing is threaded. What the heck is that threaded for?
On the depth stop, the top post is threaded, and the depth stop component is just used on a number of our products. Economies of scale, naturally. The threaded hole there is just used for one of those.
So, moving on, the next thing was the thing that holds the iron. This is a huge improvement. So the fact that this is held in place with a screw to the main casting is really, really nice, because if any of you have a Record 043, you've probably played that game where you're fumbling around with this thing trying to get it back in place because, well, you changed the iron and that stupid thing fell out because it's not attached to the plane. So that's really nice. And then there's obviously just this thumb screw at the top, and it just kind of acts as a pivot. So the iron goes in here, you tighten it down, pretty straightforward. This was another pretty nice improvement. This is the 044. So something that had was the same sort of a thing. So on the 044, it's got this little thumb screw that holds the plane iron against the body of the plane. And that's pretty nice on the 044. That's what this little brass thumb screw is for. It's just going to hold that plane iron against the main casting of the body, which is pretty nice for your setup. It kind of lets you get all of that in there exactly where it's supposed to be. These screws, I have them, like I said, these are brass. I put these in there. Normally it comes with 2 Allen screws. Again, not going to keep beating on that.
Ah, yes. When is a design project considered done? The eternal question. We generally start with a well-defined brief of what the product needs to be: performance, capability, size, cost, etc. Some of these requirements are incompatible and must be balanced, i.e. using the fence call-it system versus cost. The design cycle often goes through a number of iterations before we achieve definitive design where all requirements are met and or balanced to an acceptable degree. At that point, we proceed to producing the product. Some products go through this process very quickly, others require multiple iterations. For the Boxmaker's plow plane, there was a few iterations for ergonomics, really just developing the shape of the grip, and then many iterations to try and get the single rod fence to work before we switched to the double rods. The overall design process flow, how we do it and what we do, is not that complicated, really. Other than some preliminary hand sketching, pretty much all of our design work is done in a 3D parametric CAD environment. Manufacturing data, such as dual paths and casting molds, etc., are produced directly from these 3D files. We have in-house rapid prototyping machines for evaluating form, ergonomics, and basic functions as well. For definitive working prototypes, we can get metal rapid prototype parts, which is pretty nice. These are generally created as the casting and are used to prove out machining as well. Occasionally, we'll make quick models by hand, but the speed of a 3D printer is such that it's increasingly easier to just use those for everything. Also, for organic forms especially, translating a physical model into a CAD system is sometimes problematic. 3D scanners can digitize a surface, but that data requires huge amounts of processing in order for it to become a usable surface in a CAD system. It is much easier to create the geometry in CAD, print it out for evaluation, and then tweak it as necessary. For the most part, a single designer owns a project. Most of our products are relatively simple, so it's difficult to parcel off different elements to separate the designers and then integrate all that after it's done. That being said, product designs are evaluated by the entire team, including input from manufacturing and a core group of in-house testers.
All right, so I did a bunch of work with the Boxmaker's plow plane. It is a pretty good tool. I do like it. I do think there are some things that I personally don't like. I know I harped on these thumb screws a lot, or lack of. Those button head screws with the Allen wrench, not a fan. Don't really like the fact that the rods move with the fence instead of being able to lock them into the body, because I've had issues with these stupid things hitting my holdfasts. Obviously, if that's not the way you work, if you don't use holdfasts, if you use more of like a tail vise or something like that, might not really be as much of an issue, but I happen to use a lot of holdfasts because that's just part of my workflow. Other than that, it's pretty good. I would say, maybe comparing this to the Record 043. So obviously, we've got irons in these, so I'm going to probably cut myself before this is over. Boxmaker's plow plane, Record 043, I would say there's actually some pretty good improvements on the Boxmaker's plow plane. I do find this to actually be a little bit more comfortable in my right hand. So that little ledge at the bottom and then the slightly larger back part of it, I think is actually pretty comfortable. I really enjoy the way that this just kind of sits right in my hand. This one is fine, but it's just not quite as comfortable because of this main rear piece, basically. But otherwise, it's okay. It's just not quite as good. With the opposite side, though, however, I understand why they wouldn't go with the same style of fence, because I'm sure this style of fence is a lot cheaper and easier to make, whereas this one would probably have more waste, more time, whatever. But I just find this one a little bit more comfortable because I like that little kind of grip there. I don't normally just grab it like that, you know, like you might just pretend like it's a handle or something, but I just kind of find it, the way I hold it is usually my thumb is in here tucked in behind the rib that kind of bows out, and then I usually put it up against the front rod. So I just find that a little bit more comfortable, because when I do the same grip here, there's just nothing for my hand to register against. It just doesn't quite find anything comfortable for me. So I just feel like my left hand is a lot more cramped on the Boxmaker's plow plane. But again, it's kind of minor, you know. It's really not that big of a deal, because if you just push against the fence that way, it's not a huge problem. But again, I guess, like I said, I kind of prefer the fence on the 043 over the Veritas fence, kind of all around, just because of the rods and the thumb screws and the way that you can attach the wooden fence to this plane, not having to thread into the actual casting, so it gives you a lot of flexibility as far as making an auxiliary fence. The blade retention on the 043, way worse. I mean, it works, sure, but if you've ever used an 043, this little piece here that holds the iron in place, oh man, that thing has fallen out on me pretty much every time I've changed irons. I really like that it's attached to the Boxmaker's plow plane, and I also really like this thumb screw that holds the plane blade against the body. It's just a really nice feature that, frankly, vastly outshines the 043. So definitely a huge improvement there. And then obviously the ability to use a beating iron in this thing is pretty nice. So I've actually already used this a couple times for using the beating irons, and I just like decorative beads, so I guess that's kind of a big deal for me. So overall, I really like this plane. It is a pretty good plane. It's well made. It feels good. It works great. Is it worth it? That's always the hard question, isn't it? There's reasons why I want to say yes. There's reasons why I want to say no. I really like it. I think it's worth it. At $160, that's a pretty good plane for a pretty good price. Because when you consider the fact that a lot of these 043s are actually going for $120, $140. I mean, granted, you usually get the 3 irons that it came with for that instead of just the one in the Boxmaker's plow plane. But still, in the US, they're not as common as they might be over in Europe, just because of where they were made, where they were originally sold. So the pricing is really competitive. I was actually kind of impressed with the cost of this plane versus the value that it gives you. The only thing is, once you start adding in all those irons, then you're starting to kiss like $300, and that's getting to be a little bit expensive. But if you buy only the irons you think you're going to use as you're going to use them, that's probably a little bit better. You can get away with using like 45 irons if you want to use the wider ones, but once you get into like 1/8 inch, 3/16, we already covered that. Can't really use this with those irons just because they miss and not good things happen. So yeah, I guess whether or not it's worth it is really a personal thing. If you've got a small plow plane from Veritas and you've got a bunch of their irons, then this is a lot easier to say yes, absolutely worth it, because all of those irons work in this thing, which is really nice. If you were thinking about getting a small plow plane, this might also be an easy springboard, because you just need a little bit of that taste, and yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I mean that's basically it. I think it's worth it. I like it. Obviously, I'm going to keep it. I don't plan on selling it. I would recommend using thumb screws if you don't think you can get it tight enough just by hand. then I would say go ahead and get some thumb screws with slotted heads in them, just because I think it's a lot better. I really don't like those button head screws. If you have the ability to make your own fence rods, I would probably do that too. I'm gonna probably see if I can figure out a way, Kenny, if I can bribe some people, you know, maybe blackmail if I had to, but no. Some shorter rods would just be really nice, and I think that's something that I'm probably going to pursue. But I mean, it's a great plane. I really like it. If it's worth it to you, I don't think you'll go wrong. If you don't think it's worth it to you, I'm perfectly able to accept that as well, because it is a fair amount of money, and there's a lot of other planes that do what it does. I just really like that one. So with that, I sure hope you found this useful. I really appreciate those of you that stuck all the way through this. I know it was pretty long. I'll probably have some other videos in the future just to kind of show some more pieces of it in use, maybe cut down, boil it down. But yeah, this was kind of the overview review and I guess my general thoughts on it. So yeah, I will catch you in the next one.